The sea fog parts, revealing the unmistakable silhouettes of longboats cutting through the waves, their dragon-headed prows silent witnesses to the panic about to erupt onshore. This wasn't just another dawn for the people of medieval Europe. It was the moment their world changed forever. The Vikings didn't just arrive, they struck with precision, leaving shattered kingdoms and rewritten destinies in their wake. From the sacred halls of Lindisfarne to the gilded gates of Paris, these raiders didn't merely loot, they reshaped history itself. Today, we're uncovering the 20 most brutal Viking raids, the ones that didn't just burn villages but forged empires and birthed legends. You'll see how a single night of terror could topple kings, inspire myths, and echo through the centuries. This isn't just a tale of axes and fire. It's the story of how fear became power and how the shadow of the Northmen stretched far beyond their ships. The morning of June 8, 793, began like any other for the monks of Lindisfarne. Prayers in the quiet sanctuary of their island monastery, the rhythmic lapping of waves against the shore. But by nightfall, their world was reduced to ashes and blood. The Northmen came without warning, their ships appearing like phantoms in the mist. They shattered the monastery's gates, seizing golden crucifixes, jeweled gospels, and silver chalices, treasures meant for God now ripped away by pagan hands. Those who resisted were cut down without mercy. The survivors wrote of the horror in trembling ink, calling it divine wrath, but this wasn't punishment from heaven. It was something far more terrifying, the calculated cruelty of men who knew exactly what they wanted. Lindisfarne wasn't chosen at random. This was the spiritual heart of Northumbria, a place so sacred that even kings sought its blessings. By striking here, the Vikings weren't just stealing wealth, they were proving that no institution, no matter how holy, lay beyond their reach. The shockwaves rippled across Christendom. For the first time, Europe faced an enemy who didn't respect the rules of war or the protection of the church. And this raid was just the beginning. The monks' desperate accounts became a blueprint for terror, copied and carried from court to court. Kings who read them must have felt a cold dread creeping in, because if the Vikings could desecrate Lindisfarne, nowhere was safe. What made this attack so devastating wasn't just the violence. It was the message. The Northmen had declared themselves a force to be reckoned with, not through conquest, but through sheer, audacious terror. When they sailed away, laden with sacred loot, they left behind more than smoldering ruins. They left a question that would haunt Europe for centuries. What will they take from us next? The rivers of Francia had always been peaceful trade routes until the day dragon-prowed ships sliced through the Seine's currents like knives. By the spring of 845, rumors of burned villages and slaughtered garrisons had already reached Paris, but nothing could prepare the city for the sight of hundreds of Vikings under a name that would echo through history: Ragnar Lothbrok. This was no mere band of raiders, it was a calculated strike against the heart of the Frankish kingdom. Ragnar's forces moved with terrifying efficiency, torching everything in their path until they stood before Paris itself. The city's walls, once thought impregnable, crumbled under the Viking onslaught. King Charles the Bald had a choice: fight and risk total destruction, or pay a price so staggering it would empty his treasury. He chose gold over glory. What made this raid legendary wasn't just the sack of Paris, it was the glaring weakness it exposed. The Franks were fractured, their rulers locked in petty squabbles, while Ragnar exploited every division. The Vikings didn't just take silver, they revealed how vulnerable Europe's kingdoms truly were. And when Ragnar's fleet finally withdrew, weighed down with 7,000 pounds of Frankish silver, one truth became undeniable: the age of Viking terror had only just begun. The English coast lay shrouded in mist that August morning in 991 as Beatnoth, Earl of Essex, watched the Viking longships emerge from the haze. He could have barred the Blackwater River, trapped the invaders at sea, until pride whispered a fatal suggestion: let them land, fight them honorably, man to man. That decision would echo through history, not just as a battle lost, but as a lesson in how Viking leaders twisted their enemies' virtues into weaknesses. Olaf Tryggvason wasn't just any raider. A future king of Norway, he understood something deeper than axes and shields: the power of shame. When the Vikings demanded tribute, 13,000 pounds of silver to leave peacefully, Byrhtnoth refused. Not out of strategy, but outraged dignity. "We'll pay you in spear points," his warriors jeered. The trap was set. By allowing the Vikings to cross the causeway, Byrhtnoth gave away his only advantage: the terrain. The moment their boots hit dry land, the slaughter began. The Anglo-Saxon poem The Battle of Maldon preserves the grim poetry of that day. How warriors fought shoulder to shoulder even as hope vanished. How an old retainer vowed to avenge his fallen lord, though it meant certain death. But beneath the legend lies a colder truth. The Vikings didn't just win through strength. They won because they understood their enemies. Byrhtnoth's rigid code of honor became the noose around his neck, while Olaf's men fought without rules, adapting, feinting, exploiting every gap. When the last Saxon banners fell, the lesson was carved into England's bones. The Vikings weren't merely pirates, they were masters of manipulation. They'd turned pride into a weapon and left behind a warning etched in verse: sometimes the deadliest blade isn't steel. It's knowing exactly what your enemy values and using it against him. By late spring 845, Hamburg was thriving, its timber churches glowing in the dawn light, its marketplace humming with traders and pilgrims. That peace shattered when longships surged up the Elbe River, their sails bearing the unmistakable silhouette of Norse raiders. Within hours, flames engulfed the city's great cathedral, its golden reliquaries torn from the altar as monks fled in terror. The attackers weren't just after silver, they aimed to break something far more valuable: the spine of Christian authority in Saxony. Archbishop Ansgar, known as the Apostle of the North, had spent decades building Hamburg into a beacon of faith. The Vikings reduced it to blackened timbers and scattered bones. Their brutality was no accident, it was a brutal advertisement. By torching a cathedral and slaughtering clergy, they proved that neither walls nor prayers could stop them. The message ricocheted across Europe: if a holy city like Hamburg could fall, no bishop's crozier or king's decree offered protection. Yet the raid's true genius lay in its timing. The Vikings struck just as Louis the German, ruler of East Francia, was embroiled in a civil war. They exploited chaos like craftsmen splitting seasoned wood, precise, effortless. When Louis finally rallied forces, the raiders had already vanished, leaving behind smoldering ruins and a chilling legacy. This wasn't mere piracy. It was psychological warfare designed to paralyze Christendom with fear. And as Hamburg's embers cooled, every ruler from Aachen to Rome understood the stakes. The age of unchecked Viking terror had arrived. The fifth raid, the raid on Seville, 844 Vikings in the Islamic World sunlight glinted off the Guadalquivir River as the people of Seville went about their day, unaware that a nightmare from the north was sailing toward them. Viking longships didn't belong in the waters of Al-Andalus until they did. By the time the watchtowers spotted the dragon-headed prows, it was too late. These weren't just raiders in unfamiliar lands. They were predators who'd learned to hunt far beyond their known world. Most stories of Viking terror unfold in the misty fjords of Scandinavia or the monasteries of England and Francia. But in 844, the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba learned a brutal lesson. The Northmen could strike anywhere. Seville, a thriving jewel of Islamic Spain, had no walls ready to repel invaders from the sea. The Vikings sacked the city with terrifying speed, looting its markets, burning its mosques, and taking prisoners by the hundreds. What made this raid extraordinary wasn't just the distance traveled. it was the Vikings' chilling adaptability. These were men who had grown up navigating icy northern seas, yet now they fought under the scorching Spanish sun, against enemies who spoke a language they didn't understand in a land utterly foreign to them. And they nearly won. For weeks they held Seville hostage, even defeating a relief force sent by Emir Abd al-Rahman II. But the Umayyads weren't like the fractured kingdoms of Europe. They fought back with organized fury, using Greek fire, a weapon the Vikings had never faced, to burn their ships. The surviving raiders fled, but the shockwaves lingered. The emirate fortified its coasts, built watchtowers, and even formed a specialized navy. For the first time, the Vikings had met an enemy who not only resisted but learned from them. And yet, the raid left another legacy. Arab chroniclers, though horrified, couldn't help but admire their foes' ferocity. They wrote of towering warriors with eyes like burning coals, and the emir himself would later recruit Viking mercenaries as elite bodyguards. Seville proved something unexpected. The Vikings weren't just mindless destroyers. They were a force so formidable that even their enemies respected them and sometimes hired them. The Feast of St. John should have been a day of celebration in Nance, a time for prayer, music, and the glow of bonfires along the Loire River. But on that June morning in 843, the flames that rose weren't from festive pyres. They were from Viking torches. The raiders had timed their attack with cruel precision. While the city's defenders relaxed during the holy festival, the longships slipped upstream unnoticed. By the time the alarm sounded, it was too late. The Northmen stormed the cathedral itself, cutting down Bishop Gohard at the altar as he raised the Eucharist. Congregants who moments earlier had been kneeling in prayer now fled through streets slick with blood. This wasn't just another raid, it was a calculated desecration. Attacking during a major feast day ensured maximum chaos. Pilgrims packed the city, gates stood open, and guards were distracted. The Vikings didn't just exploit weakness, they created it by striking when their enemies were least prepared. The horror didn't end with the massacre. Survivors described how the invaders dragged away prisoners by the hundreds, nobles, craftsmen, even children, to be sold in distant slave markets. The Loire, once a bustling trade route, now ran red. But the real shock wasn't the brutality, it was the realization that no tradition, no sacred day offered protection. The Vikings had turned piety into a vulnerability. For the people of Francia, the Sack of Nantes became a grim turning point. Chronicles called it the day God looked away. Yet for the raiders, it was something else entirely, proof that timing could be as deadly as any axe. They hadn't just stolen wealth, they'd rewritten the rules of war, showing Europe that even its holiest moments weren't safe from the dragon-headed prow. Dorstad wasn't just a town, it was a river of silver. Located where the Rhine split into its tributaries, this bustling Frisian port pulsed with traders from Saxony, Francia, and beyond. Goldsmiths weighed coins in market stalls, merchants haggled over rolls of fine Frankish wool, and ships from as far as Baghdad unloaded spices onto creaking docks. Then, in 834, the Northmen arrived. What happened next wasn't a raid, it was a siege in slow motion. Unlike the lightning strikes on monasteries, the Vikings returned to Dorstad 4 times in just 15 years. They didn't just want its wealth, they wanted to bleed it dry. Each attack followed the same ruthless pattern. Sails appearing at dawn, axes splintering warehouse doors, and longboats sinking low under the weight of stolen goods. But here's what made Dorstad different. The Vikings weren't just destroying, they were learning. By striking the same target repeatedly, they mapped its weaknesses like surgeons probing a wound. They noticed which merchant houses paid ransoms fastest, which streets bottlenecked fleeing defenders, even which tides made escape impossible. This wasn't mindless violence, it was a masterclass in economic warfare. The impact rippled far beyond the smoldering docks. Dorstad had been the tax collection hub for Emperor Louis the Pious. With its trade networks shattered, imperial revenues collapsed. Local rulers, desperate to protect other towns, diverted funds to build fortifications instead of armies. The Vikings had discovered a terrifying truth: if you cripple the money, you cripple the kingdom. Yet the raid's cruelest twist lay in its aftermath. As Dorstad's survivors rebuilt, they unknowingly set the stage for the next attack. Their very resilience became a lure. Why risk sailing to new targets when one gold-rich town kept refilling its coffers? The Northmen didn't just exploit wealth, they turned recovery into a trap. And with each return, they left behind more than ruins. They left a blueprint for how to strangle an empire, one trade route at a time. The walls of Winchester had stood for centuries, sheltering kings and hoarding the wealth of Wessex, until the summer of 860, when smoke blotted out the sun. This wasn't a hit-and-run attack on some isolated priory. The Vikings had come for a royal capital, the very seat of Anglo-Saxon power. What made this raid so audacious wasn't just the scale of destruction, it was the target. Winchester was no backwater. Its streets bustled with goldsmiths, its mint-stamped coins bearing the face of King Ethelbert, and its great minster housed relics that drew pilgrims from across Britain. By burning it, the Vikings weren't just looting, they were sending a message carved in flames: your throne is not safe. The attack exposed a chilling shift in strategy. Earlier raids had focused on soft, undefended targets, but Winchester lay inland, protected by walls and garrisoned troops. The fact that Viking forces could penetrate so deep into Wessex revealed something far more alarming. They'd mastered the art of striking at the heart of kingdoms, not just their edges. Yet the true genius lay in the chaos that followed. Chroniclers wrote of warriors vanishing into the countryside like ghosts, only to reappear miles away. This wasn't mindless destruction, it was psychological warfare. Every burning farmstead between Winchester and the coast deepened the terror, making villagers question whether their own leaders could protect them. For Wessex, the scars ran deeper than charred timber. The raid exposed cracks in its defenses: slow musters, fragmented communication, garrisons caught unprepared. But it also planted a seed of resilience. Within decades, Alfred the Great would study these very failures to build a new system of fortified towns and rapid response armies. The Vikings had intended to break Wessex. Instead, they unknowingly forged its future king into the man who would one day stop them. The winds howled around Iona's rocky shores as the monks bent over their manuscripts, their quills scratching quietly in the dim candlelight. This tiny island off Scotland's west coast wasn't just a monastery. It was a sanctuary of learning, a place where sacred texts like the Book of Kells were painstakingly copied, word by word, into works of art. For centuries, its isolation had been its shield, until the summer of 806, when the sea itself turned against them. The Vikings didn't just raid Iona, they desecrated it. The attack wasn't a hurried smash and grab for silver. It was a systematic slaughter. Monks were cut down at their prayer desks, their blood staining the very parchment they dedicated their lives to preserving. Those who survived the initial onslaught fled into the night, clutching what treasures they could carry, including the precious Book of Kells, its illuminated pages barely saved from the flames. But why Iona? This wasn't some wealthy trading hub. Its value wasn't measured in gold, but in something far more potent: symbolism. As the spiritual heart of Celtic Christianity, its destruction sent shockwaves across Britain and Ireland. The message was clear: nowhere, not even the holiest of islands, lay beyond the reach of the Northmen. The raid's aftermath was just as devastating as the violence itself. The surviving monks abandoned Iona entirely, relocating to Kells in Ireland for safety. For decades, the island stood empty, its broken altars a grim monument to Viking ruthlessness. Yet even in this act of retreat, the monks made sure their legacy survived. The Book of Kells endured, carried to new shores proof that while the Vikings could shatter stone and scatter communities, they couldn't erase the faith and knowledge those monks had preserved. What made this attack different wasn't just the brutality. It was the chilling realization that even the most remote, sacred spaces were now battlegrounds. If the Vikings would cross stormy seas to butcher monks on a windswept rock, what sanctuary remained? The answer, whispered in the embers of Iona's scriptorium, was simple: none. The Seine River had always been Rouen's lifeline, its waters carrying merchant ships laden with grain, wine, and Frankish luxuries. But in 841, those same currents brought death. Viking longships, their hulls scarred from countless raids, slid past undefended bends in the river, their crews silent as shadows. By the time the city's watchmen sounded the alarm, it was too late. What unfolded in Rouen wasn't just another raid. It was a chilling preview of the future. The Vikings didn't just loot and leave, they lingered. While other attacks were swift and brutal, here they methodically dismantled the city's defenses, seizing control of key crossings and outlying farms. For weeks, they ruled the ruins like conquering lords, testing the waters of something unprecedented: permanence. The Frankish response revealed just how vulnerable the region was. King Charles the Bald, distracted by civil war, could only muster a token force to drive them out, and even that victory was hollow. The Vikings retreated, but not far. They camped on nearby islands, watching, waiting. Rouen had taught them a crucial lesson: France's heartland wasn't just rich, it was ripe for the taking. This raid marked a turning point in Viking strategy. No longer content with hit-and-run assaults, they began eyeing the Seine Valley as more than a target. It was real estate. Within decades, their descendants would carve out Normandy, a Viking-founded duchy that reshaped Europe. The Sack of Rouen wasn't just a moment of terror. It was the first draft of history, written in smoke and ambition, and perhaps the most unsettling detail: the Northmen didn't just adapt to Frankish lands, they blended in. Some married local women, adopted Christianity, even swore oaths to Frankish kings. All while keeping their axes sharp, Rouen proved the Vikings weren't just destroyers. They were settlers in wolf's clothing, patient enough to turn yesterday's battlegrounds into tomorrow's homelands. The River Ouse flowed quietly through York on that fateful autumn day in 866, its waters reflecting the spires of churches and the bustle of a thriving Anglo-Saxon city. But history was about to pivot. On the horizon, sails carved through the mist, not a handful of ships, but an armada. This wasn't just another raid. The Great Heathen Army had arrived, and they weren't here for plunder alone. They came to stay, led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, and Ub. This force dwarfed anything England had faced before. Estimates suggest thousands of warriors, a tidal wave of axes and ambition. York, with its crumbling Roman walls and squabbling nobles, stood no chance. The defenders were overrun in hours, their king slain, their streets claimed by strangers speaking a guttural tongue. What made York different wasn't just the scale of violence, it was the Vikings' ruthless efficiency in governance. Rather than burn the city, they transformed it. Within weeks, Norse-run markets buzzed where Christian stalls once stood. Coins minted under Viking rule bore both crosses and Thor's hammers, a sly nod to their pragmatism. They even revived York's ancient name, Jorvik, weaving their identity into the city's bones. For the Anglo-Saxons, the loss was catastrophic. York wasn't just a city, it was Northumbria's crown jewel, a political and religious hub. Its fall shattered any illusion that Viking threats were temporary. These weren't pirates to be bought off with silver. They were landlords, tax collectors, kings in all but name. And their rule would stretch for decades, reshaping England's destiny. Yet the raid's true genius lay in what it didn't do. Unlike earlier attacks that left smoldering ruins, the Vikings preserved York's infrastructure, its roads, its river trade, even some churches. They didn't conquer to destroy, they conquered to control. In doing so, they proved something terrifying to the fractured kingdoms of Britain. The Northmen weren't just passing through. They were building a new world atop the old one, and for those living under their rule, resistance wasn't just futile, it was bad for business. The docks of London pulsed with life in the summer of 842, ships from Frisia unloading amber, Frankish merchants haggling over wool, the clink of silver pennies changing hands. Then the wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable scent of tar and salt. By the time the watchmen spotted the longships surging up the Thames, the city's fate was already sealed. This wasn't just another raid. London was the commercial heartbeat of Anglo-Saxon England, its wealth flowing through wharves and warehouses like blood through veins. The Vikings didn't just sack it, they strangled it. Warehouses crammed with Flemish cloth and Baltic timber went up in flames. The mint where coins were struck, a symbol of royal authority, was reduced to molten silver pooling in the dirt. What made this attack so devastating wasn't the violence alone. It was the precision of the strike. Unlike isolated monasteries, London thrived on connections, its markets fed by trade routes stretching from Rome to Scandinavia. By torching its docks, the Vikings didn't just steal treasure, they severed England's economic lifelines. The message was merciless: your prosperity is your weakness. Yet the raid's aftermath revealed an even darker truth. While kings could rebuild churches or rally armies, commerce was fragile. Without safe ports, merchants fled. Without merchants, taxes dried up. The Northmen had discovered a ruthless equation: burn one city and a dozen others would starve. But London's story didn't end in ashes. Like a phoenix, it would rise again, fortified, wary, and forever changed. The Vikings had taught the Anglo-Saxons a brutal lesson. Wealth without walls was just waiting to be plundered. And from that lesson, a new era of defended towns and guarded rivers would emerge. The flames of 842 didn't just destroy a city, they forged the blueprint for survival. The Irish coast had never seen ships like these before. On a quiet morning in 821, the fishermen of Wexford spotted strange vessels slicing through the waves, long, low, and carved with snarling beasts. By the time they realized these weren't traders, the blades were already glinting in the sun. Wexford wasn't just another coastal village. Nestled at the mouth of the River Slaney, it was a key node in Ireland's trade networks, brimming with goods from across the Gaelic kingdoms. But its real value lay in its vulnerability. Unlike mainland Europe, Ireland had no centralized defense, just a patchwork of petty kings locked in age-old feuds. The Vikings didn't just attack Wexford, they studied it, learning which clans hated each other, which ports were left unguarded, and how to turn local rivalries into opportunities. The massacre itself was swift and merciless. Survivors described warriors wading ashore, their axes finding easy prey among unarmed merchants and farmers. Churches were stripped of their gold, storehouses emptied of grain and wool. Yet the true horror wasn't the bloodshed, it was the aftermath. Unlike earlier raids where Vikings vanished with the tide, these raiders stayed, using Wexford's harbour as a base for deeper incursions. They'd discovered Ireland's Achilles' heel, a land so divided it couldn't unite against a common enemy. What made this raid pivotal wasn't just the violence, it was the blueprint it created. Over the next decades, Viking warlords would exploit Ireland's fractures with chilling precision, backing one king against another in exchange for tribute or land. By the time the Gaelic rulers understood the threat, Dublin, Cork, and Limerick had already become Norse strongholds. And here's the cruel irony: the very infighting that made Ireland easy prey for the Vikings also saved its culture in the long run. Without a single power to topple, the invaders could never fully conquer the island. They became just another piece on Ireland's chessboard, sometimes foes, sometimes allies, but never its masters. Wexford was where the game began, a brutal opening move in a conflict that would reshape Irish history for centuries. The 14th raid, the Siege of Ascelt 882, a king's humiliation, the Meuse River glinted under the summer sun as Frankish scouts crept closer, their stomachs tightening at the sight before them. Stretched along the banks near Ascelt, an immense Viking camp sprawled like a beast at rest, ships dragged ashore, makeshift forges belching smoke, and warriors sharpening axes with the calm of men who knew they held all the power. This wasn't just another raiding party, it was an army dug in and waiting, and at its mercy stood one of Europe's most powerful kings, Charles the Fat, with a crown on his head and humiliation in his future. The Vikings at Ascelt didn't just want loot, they wanted submission. For months, they'd raided deep into Francia, burning monasteries and villages with impunity. But this time, they did something far more audacious. They stopped running. By fortifying their camp at Ascelt, they turned the tables entirely. Instead of striking and retreating, they dared the Franks to come to them. And when Charles finally led his forces to confront them, the unthinkable happened. The king blinked first. Faced with the prospect of a bloody, uncertain battle, Charles chose negotiation over steel. The terms were ruthless. The Vikings demanded 12,000 pounds of silver and free passage up the Rhine to plunder Burgundy, essentially paying them to attack someone else. Worse, they got it. The Frankish chroniclers wrote of the treaty with barely concealed fury, calling it a stain on the realm. But the real insult wasn't the silver, it was the precedent. For the first time, a Viking force had extorted concessions not from a local lord, but from the Emperor of Francia himself. What made Ascelt so devastating wasn't just the ransom. It was the psychological toll. The Vikings had proven that even a king's army could be outmaneuvered not through brute force alone, but through sheer nerve. By refusing to flee, they'd forced Charles into a choice: risk everything in battle or pay to make the problem go away. His decision didn't just empty his treasury, it shattered the illusion of Frankish invincibility. The aftermath was as predictable as it was bleak. Within a year, Charles's nobles, disgusted by his weakness, deposed him. The Vikings, emboldened by their success, returned again and again, scenting blood in the water. Ascelt wasn't just a raid, it was a turning point. It showed Europe's rulers the bitter cost of appeasement and taught the Vikings an even darker lesson. Sometimes the richest treasure wasn't silver. It was knowing your enemy feared you more than you feared them. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the Viking longships as they coasted along the Italian shoreline, their crews squinting at the distant marble towers gleaming like ivory against the azure sea. Their target loomed ahead, or so they believed. According to legend, these Norsemen had sailed for weeks, dreaming of sacking Rome itself, the crown jewel of Christendom. Instead, they'd made a colossal error. The city before them wasn't Rome at all, it was Luna, a wealthy but far less significant port. Yet what followed was no less shocking. The raid on Luna in 860 was equal parts ambition and absurdity. The Vikings, led by the fearsome chieftain Hæstein, launched their assault with full conviction they were attacking the Eternal City. They stormed the gates only to find a town barely a fraction of Rome's size, though still rich enough to justify the effort. But the real twist came when Hæstein, realizing his mistake, doubled down on the deception. Chroniclers tell of a macabre stunt. The Vikings pretended their leader had died, claiming his final wish was a Christian burial inside Luna's walls. The unsuspecting clergy agreed only for dead Hæstein to leap from his coffin, axe in hand, as his men slaughtered the guards and threw open the gates. Why did this bizarre episode matter? Because it revealed the Vikings' greatest weapon wasn't just brute strength, it was theater. Even in failure for Rome remained untouched. They'd proven how easily fear could be weaponized. The mere suggestion that these northern demons might strike at the heart of the papacy sent tremors through Europe. Churches from Genoa to Constantinople began stockpiling relics and reinforcing their walls, not knowing where the dragon ships would appear next. Yet Luna also exposed a critical limit to Viking power. For all their cunning, they lacked the siegecraft or numbers to challenge truly fortified cities like Rome. Their genius lay in exploiting soft targets, monasteries, undefended ports, divided kingdoms. Luna was a wake-up call for Christendom. The Vikings might not be invincible, but their reputation alone could paralyze an empire. And sometimes, as Haystein proved, illusions were just as deadly as steel. The warm waters of the Mediterranean should have been a world away from the fjords of Scandinavia. But in 859, the people of Necker learned geography was no shield against Viking ambition. As the capital of a small Berber kingdom in modern-day Morocco, this thriving port city had weathered storms and rivals for centuries. Then one morning, the sea brought something far worse than a tempest: dragon ships. This wasn't just another coastal raid. Necker sat at the crossroads of Saharan gold routes and Mediterranean trade, its markets heavy with African ivory, Andalusian silk, and silver from mines deep in the Atlas Mountains. For the Vikings, it was a tantalizing prize, but reaching it required a journey that would have daunted most sailors. Sailing past the Pillars of Hercules, today's Strait of Gibraltar, they braved currents that ancient Phoenicians had considered the edge of the known world. The very fact they attempted it revealed a chilling truth. No corner of the map was too distant, no kingdom too exotic to escape their notice. What followed was a masterclass in opportunistic warfare. The Vikings didn't just sack Necker, they occupied it for 8 days, methodically stripping its wealth while local forces scrambled to respond. Arab chroniclers recorded the surreal sight of fair-skinned warriors haggling in broken Arabic over the price of stolen goods, their longships bobbing in a bay where Phoenician and Roman galleys had once anchored. Yet the raid's true significance wasn't just the distance covered or the loot carried off. It was the Vikings' sheer adaptability. These were men who had honed their skills in the freezing mists of the North Sea, yet now they navigated the scorching complexities of North African politics, trading with some tribes while burning others. They didn't just raid blindly, they learned, probing weaknesses in a region fractured by rival emirates and simmering rebellions. The aftermath rippled far beyond Necker's smoking ruins. For the first time, the Islamic world faced Viking terror not as a distant rumor from Christendom, but as a visceral threat on its own shores. Fortresses sprouted along the Maghreb coast, and rulers who'd once dismissed the Northmen as barbarians now studied their tactics with wary respect. The Vikings had stretched their shadow across 2 continents, and in doing so, proved their greatest weapon wasn't just their axes, but their range. Europe's nightmare had gone global. The 17th raid, the Sack of Pamplona, 858, a king's price in gold. Pamplona's streets bustled with the clatter of hooves and merchants calling out prices until the first scream cut through the noise. From the winding alleys near the Ebro River, men with foreign accents and unfamiliar armor surged into the open, their blades flashing. The city's guards barely had time to draw their swords before the Viking raiders were already storming the royal palace itself. This wasn't just another assault on a defenseless village. Their target was King Garsha Inyiges himself. What happened next would rewrite the rules of Viking warfare. Unlike the quick strikes on monasteries or the burning of trading towns, this raid had a chillingly precise objective: capture, don't kill. Garsha, the ruler of Pamplona, was dragged from his throne room in chains, forced to watch as his city's treasury was emptied into Viking coffers. But the real prize wasn't the gold taken that day. It was the ransom demand that followed. The Northmen didn't just want wealth, they wanted leverage. The king's captors knew something most warlords of the time overlooked. A living hostage was far more valuable than a dead noble. While a corpse might inspire revenge, a prisoner could be monetized. Garsha's subjects scrambled to gather an astronomical sum, 70,000 gold coins, a fortune that would drain Pamplona's reserves for years. The Vikings had turned their enemy's own power against him. His people's loyalty became the very chain that bound them. But the raid's true brilliance lay in its aftermath. When Garsha was finally released, humiliated but alive, the message reverberated across the Christian kingdoms of Iberia. No one, not even a crowned head, stood beyond Viking reach. Future rulers would think twice before sending armies to chase raiders, knowing their own capture could bankrupt their realms. The Northmen had discovered a terrifying equation: terror plus patience equaled profit. Yet there's an ironic footnote to this tale. After his ransom, Garsha Inyiges rebuilt his kingdom, even forming alliances with neighboring states to resist future Viking incursions. The raid that nearly broke Pamplona ultimately forged its resilience, but for the Vikings the lesson was just as clear. Sometimes the weight of a king's crown could be measured in pure, calculable gold. And they'd proven they knew exactly how to collect. The 18th raid, the Burning of Bremen 880, a bishop's nightmare dawn, had barely broken over Bremen when the first tendrils of smoke began curling into the sky. The city's wooden bridges and thatched roofs offered little resistance as flames raced through the streets, but this was no accident. The Vikings had come for more than treasure. They'd come for the man who symbolized everything they despised, Archbishop Rimbert, the spiritual leader of Saxony. Unlike earlier raids that struck random monasteries, Bremen was a calculated blow against the heart of Christian power in northern Germany. Rimbert wasn't just a priest, he was a political force, a key ally of the Frankish emperor. By targeting him, the Vikings sent an unmistakable message: your God cannot protect you. The attack unfolded with terrifying precision. Longships slipped up the Weser River under cover of darkness, their crews disembarking before the city's watchmen could sound the alarm. By the time Rimbert's guards realized what was happening, the Vikings were already battering down the doors of his residence. The archbishop, according to chroniclers, escaped only by scrambling through a hidden passage moments before his quarters were reduced to smoldering wreckage. What made Bremen different wasn't just the violence, it was the symbolic cruelty. The Vikings didn't just loot churches, they burned the cathedral's precious library, centuries of manuscripts curling into ash. They shattered reliquaries, scattering the bones of saints. They even defaced the tombs of past bishops, a deliberate insult to both the living and the dead. This wasn't mere plundering, it was cultural warfare designed to break the spirit of those who resisted. Yet the raid's most chilling revelation was the Vikings' growing sophistication. They didn't just attack Bremen, they studied it. Local accounts hint at whispers in the market squares beforehand, strangers asking about the archbishop's routines. The Northmen had learned that to cripple a city, you didn't just destroy its buildings, you shattered its leadership. Bremen's embers cooled, but the scars remained. For Rimbert, the trauma reshaped his entire mission. He'd later fund fortifications and rally neighboring towns to resist future raids. But for the Vikings, the lesson was clear. Fear was a weapon sharper than any axe. And when wielded against the right targets, it could bring even the mightiest to their knees. The rugged coast of Anglesey had always been a natural fortress for the Welsh, a land of steep cliffs and swirling tides where Celtic kings could hold out against invaders for generations. But in the year 853, the sea betrayed them. Where others saw an impenetrable stronghold, the Vikings saw an opportunity. This wasn't just another coastal raid. Anglesey was the breadbasket of Wales, its fertile fields feeding kingdoms and its monasteries guarding priceless relics. More importantly, it was a symbol of Welsh defiance. For centuries, its people had resisted Saxons, Romans, even earlier raiders. But the Northmen came with a strategy none had anticipated. They didn't just attack Anglesey, they conquered it. Eyewitness accounts describe longships landing not at undefended beaches, but at the base of sheer cliffs, their crews scaling rock faces like wolves climbing a sheepfold. The Welsh, accustomed to enemies faltering at their natural barriers, were caught utterly unprepared. Viking axes flashed in the dawn light as they overran farmsteads and seized the island's vital grain stores. Within days, the once proud stronghold was reduced to a smoking tribute to Norse ruthlessness. What made this raid so devastating wasn't just the violence, it was the Vikings' refusal to play by the old rules of warfare. Previous invaders had been deterred by Anglesey's geography, but the Northmen treated obstacles as mere suggestions. Their secret, a mastery of seamanship so complete, they could land virtually anywhere, turning the Welsh's greatest advantage, their isolation, into a fatal trap. Yet the raid's true impact lay in its psychological blow. The Welsh had believed their island was blessed, protected by the same tides that drowned lesser foes. Now that faith lay shattered like the gates of their monasteries. For the first time, the unthinkable became reality. No stronghold, no matter how remote or rugged, was truly safe. And here's the cruel twist. Anglesey's fall didn't just embolden the Vikings, it exposed the fragility of Welsh unity. Within years, local rulers began paying Danegeld, bribing the Northmen to attack their rivals instead. The raid hadn't just broken a fortress, it had fractured a culture's will to resist. The lesson echoed across Britain. When facing an enemy who fears no frontier, even the mightiest cliffs are just rocks waiting to be climbed. The Bosphorus Strait had never seen sails like these before. On a summer morning in 860, the guards of Constantinople, the wealthiest, most fortified city in the Christian world, stared in disbelief as hundreds of Viking longships emerged from the mist. These weren't the familiar traders from the north. These were the Rus, a fearsome branch of Norse warriors who had carved a path through the rivers of Eastern Europe, and now they stood at the very gates of the Byzantine Empire. What happened next wasn't just a raid, it was a spectacle of pure audacity. The Rus, led by the legendary chieftains Ascald and Dyer, didn't just skirmish at the edges of the city. They launched a full-scale assault, their ships circling the Golden Horn like wolves surrounding prey. For the first time in centuries, the mighty Theodosian walls, the same barriers that had defied Persians, Arabs, and Avars, faced warriors who fought like tempests given human form. Yet the true surprise wasn't the attack itself. It was the reaction of Constantinople's ruler, Emperor Michael III. Instead of dismissing the Vikings as mere barbarians, he recognized their terrifying potential. When the Rus finally retreated, driven off by storms, Byzantine fire, or sheer exhaustion, the emperor made them an offer: join us. Here's where history takes a fascinating turn. The very warriors who had just laid siege to the city soon became its elite protectors. The Byzantines, masters of realpolitik, saw what others had missed. The Vikings' ferocity could be harnessed. Ascald and Dyer's men were inducted into the Varangian Guard, a corps of foreign mercenaries tasked with defending the emperor himself. But why did this raid matter so much? Because it revealed a truth that would shape empires. The Vikings weren't just destroyers, they were adapters. They could pivot from plunderers to partners in the blink of an eye. Constantinople didn't just buy them off, it bought into them, setting a precedent that would echo for centuries. The Rus went home with pockets full of silver, but they also carried something far more valuable: a newfound respect from the most powerful civilization on earth. And perhaps the most poetic twist, the descendants of these very Vikings would one day found the Kievan Rus, the precursor to modern Russia and Ukraine. The siege that began in fire and fury ended with an alliance that reshaped the map of Europe. the Northmen had reached the edge of the known world and left their mark on history itself. From the first terrified screams at Lindisfarne to the echoing war cries beneath Constantinople's golden walls, one truth stands clear: the Vikings didn't just raid, they rewrote history. What began as lightning strikes on undefended monasteries evolved into a masterclass in psychological warfare, economic manipulation, and even empire building. These 20 raids weren't random acts of brutality. They were chess moves in a game that stretched across continents, toppling kings, redrawing borders, and leaving scars that still whisper to us today. Yet the real surprise isn't the violence, it's the evolution. Watch how these raiders morphed from opportunistic pirates to shrewd politicians, burning Paris one decade, then ruling Normandy the next. They didn't just exploit weaknesses, they studied them, turning Frankish infighting, Anglo-Saxon pride, and even Byzantine bureaucracy into weapons as lethal as their axes. The lesson: the Vikings weren't just stronger or fiercer, they were smarter. And here's the twist: their greatest legacy isn't the chaos they caused, but the worlds they accidentally built. Viking raids forced Europe to adapt. Alfred the Great's fortified towns, Charlemagne's centralized armies, even the blending of Norse and Gaelic cultures that birthed iconic figures like Brian Boru. The very kingdoms that feared them grew stronger to survive them. So, what's your take? Did these raids leave behind ashes or opportunities? Let's debate in the comments. And if you've got a favorite Viking story that didn't make the cut, share it below. History's full of unsung sagas. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the past, where legends aren't just told, they're lived.